Captain Aria Lewis had flown Blackhawks through worse conditions, but as the RPG streaked toward her helicopter over hostile territory, she knew this mission was about to go catastrophically wrong. At 28 years old, with 8 years of military aviation experience, she had already earned a reputation as one of the youngest and most capable pilots in her unit. But right now, every instinct screamed that the next 60 seconds would determine whether her crew lived or died. The rocket-propelled grenade struck the tail rotor with devastating precision, sending the Black Hawk into an uncontrolled spin 800 feet above enemy-controlled terrain. In the 3 seconds before impact, Aria had one thought: keep her crew alive through the crash, because surviving meant they'd have to fight their way through an entire enemy force that thought shooting down an American helicopter meant an easy victory. What those 50 hostile fighters below didn't know was that Aria's crew consisted of combat veterans who'd trained for exactly this scenario, and the weapons lockers on that Black Hawk contained enough firepower to turn their ambush into the last mistake they'd ever make. The mission had started as routine aerial reconnaissance, map enemy positions, identify supply routes, and return to base before sunset. Aria's Black Hawk carried a crew of 6, herself as pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Torres as co-pilot, 2 door gunners, Staff Sergeant Malcolm Pierce and Sergeant Jake Morrison, and 2 intelligence specialists, Corporal Emma Reeves and Corporal Tyler Nash, who were gathering imagery and signals intelligence. They'd been operating in this region for 3 weeks without serious incident. Enemy forces were present but disorganized, lacking the heavy weapons or coordination to seriously threaten coalition aircraft. That assessment had been catastrophically wrong. Aria was making a standard pass over a valley when Torres spotted movement on a ridgeline. "Captain, I've got what looks like—" The rest of his warning was drowned out by the proximity alarm screaming that a rocket-propelled grenade was inbound. Aria had maybe 2 seconds to react, but 2 seconds wasn't enough when an RPG was already in flight. The impact was devastating. The rocket struck the tail rotor assembly, shredding the mechanism that kept the Black Hawk stable. Instantly, the helicopter began spinning, a phenomenon pilots called loss of tail rotor authority that was every aviator's nightmare. Aria's training took over. "Brace for impact!" "Auto rotation!" She cut engine power and adjusted collective pitch, trying to convert their violent spin into something survivable. The Black Hawk was falling, spinning, and there was nothing she could do except try to control the uncontrollable. Through the spinning chaos, she caught glimpses of the ground rushing up, rocky terrain, scattered trees, and worst of all, enemy fighters moving toward their projected impact point. They'd shot down the helicopter and were already moving to capture or kill the crew. "Everybody secure!" "This is going to be rough." The Black Hawk hit hard, the impact throwing Aria against her harness with force that would leave bruises for weeks. The helicopter bounced, rolled partially onto its side, and came to rest in a cloud of dust and debris. For a moment, there was only the sound of settling metal and her own breathing. Then, training overrode shock. "Sound off!" "Who's mobile?" "Co-pilot mobile." Torres was already unbuckling, blood running from a gash on his forehead but moving with purpose. "Port gunner, mobile!" Staff Sergeant Pierce called from the left side, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Starboard gunner, mobile but injured." Sergeant Morrison was favoring his left shoulder but on his feet. "Intel 1, mobile." Corporal Reeves from the intelligence team, already moving toward the weapons locker. "Intel 2, mobile." Corporal Nash responded, checking Morrison's injury. All 6 crew members alive. Against odds that should have killed them, everyone had survived the crash, but survival meant nothing if they couldn't get to weapons before enemy fighters reached them. "Weapons locker now. Pierce, Reeves, establish perimeter security. Torres, help me with the emergency kit. Nash, check Morrison's injury. We've got maybe 2 minutes before they're on top of us." The crew moved with the precision of people who'd trained together for months. Pierce kicked open the weapons locker, pulling out rifles and ammunition, while Reeves grabbed an M240B machine gun, the 7.62 millimeter belt-fed weapon that would be their best defense against the numbers coming toward them. Arya grabbed an HK-416 assault rifle, the modern upgrade to the M4 platform that fired 5.56mm rounds with devastating reliability. She loaded a 30-round magazine, chambered a round, and moved to assess their tactical situation. They'd crashed in a small clearing surrounded by rocks and scattered vegetation. Good news, they had cover. Bad news, they were completely surrounded by higher ground, which meant enemy fighters would have superior firing positions. Torres appeared beside her with binoculars, scanning the ridgelines. I count at least 30 hostiles moving toward us from 3 directions. They're not rushing. They think we're dead or too injured to fight. They're wrong about that. Weapon status? Arya asked. 6 HK-416 with 30 magazines between us. 1 M240B with 600 rounds, 6 sidearms, 4 grenades, and whatever ammunition we can scavenge from the helicopter's defensive systems. It wasn't much against 30-plus enemies, but it was enough if they used it smartly. Defensive positions, Arya ordered. Pierce, set up the M240B covering the primary approach from the north. Morrison, despite that shoulder, you're on the east approach with your HK-416. Reeves, west approach. Nash, south. Torres and I will float, reinforcing wherever they hit hardest. Rules of engagement: they shot us down in hostile territory. We're authorized to defend ourselves with lethal force. Fire discipline: make every round count. We don't know how long until extraction arrives. Captain, Pierce said as he positioned the M240B on its bipod behind a large rock, assuming they even know we went down, our transponder might not have transmitted. Arya keyed her survival radio, the emergency beacon every military aviator carried. Mayday, mayday, mayday! Raptor 2-4 down in grid sector November, Echo 7-7, 6 souls on board, all mobile, under imminent hostile fire. Request immediate QRF and close air support. How copy? Static? She tried again on different frequencies, more static. Radio's damaged or we're in a dead zone, she said. We're on our own until someone realizes we're missing and sends a search. Torres checked his watch. Command expects us back in 90 minutes. When we don't show, they'll launch search and rescue. Figure 2 hours minimum before help arrives. We need to hold this position for 2 hours against superior numbers on terrain that favors them. Then that's what we do, Arya said simply. We've all been in worse situations. We're alive, we're armed, and we're not surrendering to the people who shot us down. Questions? None of the crew spoke. They were professionals who understood the situation and trusted their captain's leadership. At 28, Arya was younger than several of her crew members, but she'd earned their respect through skill and decision-making under pressure. The first enemy fighters appeared on the northern ridgeline approximately 400 meters away. They were moving cautiously but not tactically, more like a mob than trained infantry. That gave Arya hope. Undisciplined enemies made mistakes. Hold fire until they're in effective range, she ordered. Pierce, you've got the longest range weapon with that M240. You call when to engage. Pierce tracked the approaching fighters through the M240 sights. The enemy was spreading out, probably planning to surround the crash site before moving in. Smart tactically, but it took time the crew would use to prepare. 300 meters, Pierce called. They're bunching up near that tree line. Multiple targets in a concentrated area. Recommend I engage when they reach 250 meters. Approved. Everyone else, hold fire until Pierce opens up. We'll see how they react to contact before committing all our firepower. The enemy fighters continued advancing, apparently confident the helicopter crew was dead or incapacitated. Arya could see approximately 15 in the northern group, with more moving in from east and west. They were closing the trap, but they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd underestimated their prey. 250 meters, Pierce announced. I have clear sight lines to approximately 12 targets, engaging. The M240B opened fire with the distinctive sound of a belt-fed machine gun, a steady hammering that sent 7.62mm rounds downrange at 600 rounds per minute. Pierce fired in controlled bursts, walking his fire across the enemy formation with devastating effect. Enemy fighters who'd been advancing confidently suddenly found themselves under accurate automatic fire from a crew-served weapon they hadn't expected the helicopter survivors to possess. The Northern attack collapsed immediately, fighters diving for cover or retreating to positions beyond effective range. Northern approach suppressed, Pierce reported. I'm seeing 8 to 10 still mobile, but they've gone to ground, at least 4 down, maybe more. But the Northern attack had been a probe, testing the crew's capabilities. The real assault came from the east and west simultaneously, with enemy fighters using the distraction to close distance. "Contact east!" Morrison called out, engaging with his HK-416 despite his injured shoulder. "At least 10 hostiles, 200 meters and closing." "Contact west!" Reeves opened fire, her HK-416 barking in controlled bursts. 12 to 15 hostiles, using cover and moving tactically. Arya and Torres immediately moved to reinforce. Arya took position next to Reeves on the western perimeter, while Torres supported Morrison to the east. The HK-416 in Arya's hands was familiar. She'd qualified expert with this rifle during infantry training before becoming an aviator. She engaged targets with controlled 3-round bursts, aiming for center mass on enemy fighters who were trying to use rocks and vegetation to close distance. "Conserve ammunition," she called out between bursts. "Aimed fire, no spray and pray." The eastern and western assaults were more professional than the northern probe. These fighters understood infantry tactics, using fire and movement to advance while suppressing the crew's positions with rifle fire. But the crew had better weapons, better training, and the desperation that came from knowing surrender wasn't an option. Morrison, despite his injured shoulder, was putting down accurate fire that kept the eastern assault pinned. Torres reinforced with additional fire, creating a wall of bullets that no enemy fighter wanted to cross. On the western side, Arya and Reeves worked together like a well-trained team. Reeves engaged targets at longer range with rapid semi-automatic fire, while Arya covered closer approaches, ready to switch her HK-416 to full automatic if anyone got too close. "Reloading," Reeves called, dropping behind cover to swap magazines. Arya immediately increased her rate of fire, covering Reeves's position while she was vulnerable. 2 enemy fighters tried to exploit the gap, rushing forward with rifles blazing. Arya dropped both with controlled bursts, 6 rounds total, both targets neutralized. Reeves came back up with a fresh magazine. "Thanks for the cover, Captain." That's what crew does. Keep them suppressed. The dual assault continued for 10 minutes of intense firefight before the enemy fighters broke contact, retreating to positions beyond effective rifle range. The crew had held, but they'd expended significant ammunition doing it. "Status report," Arya called out. "North still suppressed. I've got about 400 rounds left for the M240, Pierce reported. "East broken contact. I'm down to 6 magazines, Morrison said, wincing from his shoulder injury. "West retreating, 4 magazines remaining," Reeves added. Nash called from the southern position, the only approach that hadn't been tested. "South clear, full ammunition load. Nobody's hit us from this direction yet." Torres tallied the numbers. "We've got maybe enough ammunition for 1 more assault of that intensity. After that, we're down to pistols and harsh language." Arya checked her watch. They'd been on the ground for 40 minutes. If command had realized they were missing immediately and launched quick reaction force immediately, help was still at least 70 minutes away. They needed to conserve ammunition and find a way to even the odds. "The helicopter," Arya said suddenly. "Does it have any ammunition left in the defensive systems?" Torres looked at the crashed Black Hawk, still largely intact despite the rough landing. "The door guns were loaded when we crashed. If they're still functional, that's at least 200 rounds of 7.62 millimeters for each gun. Maybe more. Pierce, you're the crew chief. Can you salvage ammunition from the door guns?" "I can try, but I'll be exposed while I work on them. The helicopter's in the middle of our perimeter. Anyone on those ridgelines will have sight lines to it." "Reeves, Nash, provide covering fire if Pierce draws attention. Torres, you're in command while I'm gone. I'm going with Pierce to help salvage what we can. We need that ammunition." The dash to the helicopter took 15 seconds across open ground. Arya and Pierce reached the aircraft without drawing fire. The enemy was regrouping, not watching closely enough. The port side door gun was still mounted and intact. Pierce checked the feed mechanism. "The ammo can took damage during the crash, but there's still a belt loaded, maybe 150 rounds." Pull it and bring it to your M240 position. What about the starboard gun? They moved to the other side. The starboard door gun had fared worse in the crash. The mount was bent and the weapon was non-functional. But the ammunition can was intact. This one's got at least 200 rounds that should work in my M240, Pierce said. Plus there's personal weapon storage. We might find more magazines for the HK-46s. They spent 5 minutes salvaging what they could. 350 rounds of linked 7.62mm ammunition for Pierce's M240B, plus 8 additional 30-round magazines for the HK-416S. It wasn't enough to fight a prolonged battle, but it extended their defensive capability significantly. As they carried the salvaged ammunition back to fighting positions, Arya heard something that changed everything: the distant sound of rotors. Aircraft were approaching, but friend or foe? Torres had his binoculars up, scanning the sky. I've got 2 aircraft inbound from the southeast. Can't identify yet. Wait, those are enemy attack helicopters. Chinese-made Z-10s, probably supplied by hostile state actors. They're coming in fast. Enemy attack helicopters meant the ground forces could call in air support, something the crew absolutely couldn't survive. An attack helicopter could circle beyond rifle range and destroy their position with rockets and cannon fire. Everyone to cover, Arya ordered. Disperse so one rocket doesn't get us all. If those helicopters engage, we're going to have to... She stopped mid-sentence, staring at the crashed Black Hawk, specifically at the weapons pylons that had been installed before this mission for a test evaluation. The Black Hawk had been carrying 2 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles, air-to-ground weapons meant for testing against targets during this reconnaissance mission. The missiles were still attached to the pylons, damaged in the crash, probably non-functional, but possibly... Torres, Arya grabbed her co-pilot. Can we fire the Hellfires manually? Manually? Captain, those missiles are designed to be launched from a functional aircraft with fire control systems. This helicopter is crashed and powered down. Even if the missiles themselves are intact, we'd need to... Can we or can't we? Arya demanded. Torres looked at the approaching helicopters, then at the Hellfire missiles, then back at Arya. She could see him doing the calculations, technical, tactical, and desperate. Theoretically, maybe. The Hellfires have backup manual launch modes for emergency situations. If I can access the firing mechanism and bypass the electronic safeties, I might be able to create a makeshift launch solution. But it would be incredibly dangerous, highly unreliable, and I'd be exposed to enemy fire while I work on it. Do it. Pierce, shift the M240 to cover Torres while he works. Everyone else prepare to engage those helicopters with rifle fire if they come in range. We won't do much damage, but we might make them hesitate. Torres ran to the crashed Black Hawk and began working on the Hellfire missile pylons. He was pulling access panels, cutting wires, and jury-rigging a launch system using nothing but combat knife and desperate ingenuity. The enemy helicopters were circling at about 1,500 meters, clearly coordinating with ground forces. Arya could see them through binoculars, Z-10 attack helicopters with rocket pods and 23mm cannon. One strafing run from those weapons would destroy the crew's defensive position. Torres, how long? 2 minutes, maybe 3. These missiles aren't designed to be launched from a crashed aircraft. You've got 1 minute before those helicopters are in firing position. The enemy ground forces, seeing their air support arrive, began advancing again. They knew the attack helicopters would provide covering fire that would overwhelm the crew's ability to defend. Pierce opened fire with the M240B, sending suppressive bursts toward advancing enemy fighters, but he couldn't effectively cover both the ground assault and the aerial threat. "Captain, they're setting up for gun run!" Reeves called out, tracking the helicopters through her rifle sights. 60 seconds! Torres! Working! I've bypassed the electronic firing system and created a manual trigger, but I have no targeting computer, no guidance system, and the missile might just explode on the rail instead of launching. Will it fire? Maybe. Then make it fire. The lead enemy helicopter rolled into its attack run, nose dropping as the pilot lined up on the crash site. Arya could see the rocket pods turning toward them, preparing to unleash a barrage that would kill them all. "Missile ready!" Torres shouted. "I've got it pointed in the general direction of the helicopter, but this is going to be pure luck." "Fire it!" Torres triggered his improvised launch mechanism. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then, the Hellfire missile's rocket motor ignited, and the missile lurched off the pylon in a launch that was nothing like the smooth, controlled launches these weapons were designed for. The missile wobbled, its guidance system damaged or non-functional, flying on rocket power alone without the sophisticated targeting that normally guided it to impact. It was essentially a 100-pound rocket with 20 pounds of explosive flying in the general direction of the enemy helicopter. The Z-10 pilot saw the launch and tried to evade, breaking off the attack run and banking hard right. But the Hellfire, despite its damaged state, was still flying at over 1,000 miles per hour. The pilot's evasion wasn't enough. The missile didn't hit the helicopter directly. It passed about 50 feet in front of the aircraft and proximity fused, detonating in a massive explosion that caught the Z-10 in its fragmentation pattern. The enemy helicopter shuddered, smoke pouring from its engine compartment, and began spiraling toward the ground. The pilot fought for control, but the damage was catastrophic. The Z-10 impacted a hillside 800 meters away, exploding in a fireball that sent smoke rising into the sky. The second enemy helicopter immediately broke off, climbing and turning away at maximum speed. Apparently, the pilot had no interest in facing a crashed helicopter crew that had just shot down his wingman with an impossible manual launch of a Hellfire missile. On the ground, the advancing enemy fighters stopped, stunned by what they'd just witnessed. Their air support had been destroyed by a crew they'd thought was defeated. Arya didn't waste the opportunity. Engage! Engage while they're confused. The crew opened fire, catching the enemy assault in the open while fighters were still processing the helicopter's destruction. The combination of accurate rifle fire and Pierce's M240B broke the assault completely. Enemy fighters retreated in disorder, many abandoning weapons and equipment in their haste to escape. Within 2 minutes, the battlefield was clear. The enemy had broken contact, retreating to positions where the crew couldn't reach them. Torres climbed out from under the Black Hawk, covered in hydraulic fluid and burn marks from the improvised missile launch. "Captain, I'm pretty sure that violated every safety regulation in military aviation, but it worked." Arya was laughing despite the situation, or maybe because of it. "Torres, you just manually launched a Hellfire missile from a crashed helicopter and shot down an enemy aircraft. I'm going to recommend you for a medal. Then I'm going to make sure you write the training manual for how to do it again." "Can the training manual be titled, 'How to Commit Suicide with Style'?" Pierce called out from his position. "Captain, I've got vehicles approaching from the southeast." "Stand by. I've got American flags. It's the QRF." 3 up-armored Humvees roared into the clearing, carrying the quick reaction force that had been dispatched the moment command realized the Black Hawk was overdue. 30 soldiers poured out of the vehicles, establishing a defensive perimeter while medics rushed to check the crew. A major jumped out of the lead vehicle and approached Arya. "Captain Lewis, Major Robert Caney, QRF commander. Are you injured?" "Mostly bruised, sir. Crew has minor injuries. We're mobile and we held our position." The major looked at the crashed Black Hawk, the scattered enemy equipment, the smoke rising from the destroyed enemy helicopter on the distant hillside. "Captain, did your crew shoot down that helicopter?" "Yes, sir. Chief Warrant Officer Torres manually launched a Hellfire missile from our crashed aircraft and engaged the enemy Z-10. Proximity detonation, enemy aircraft destroyed." The major stared at her like she'd just claimed to have grown wings and flown home. "You manually launched a Hellfire from a crashed helicopter?" "Torres did, sir. I just gave the order. He did the impossible part." Over the next hour, the QRF secured the area, while a heavy-lift helicopter arrived to recover the crashed Black Hawk. The crew was evacuated to the forward operating base for medical evaluation and debriefing. The debriefing lasted 4 hours. Intelligence officers couldn't quite believe that a 6-person helicopter crew had held off an enemy force estimated at 50 fighters, survived a crash from 800 feet, and then shot down an enemy attack helicopter using an improvised manual launch system. But the evidence was undeniable. 30-plus enemy casualties, 1 enemy helicopter destroyed, and all 6 American crew members alive. 3 weeks later, Arya stood at attention in a ceremony attended by 2-star generals and media from around the world. She and her crew were being awarded decorations for valor, and Torres was receiving a special commendation for his technical achievement in creating a battlefield innovation that would be studied at every military aviation school. "Captain Lewis," the commanding general said during the ceremony, "you and your crew demonstrated extraordinary courage, tactical brilliance, and the refusal to surrender that defines American military service. Your actions will be studied by military professionals for decades. But I have one question. When that helicopter was shot down and you were surrounded by enemy forces, what made you think you could win?" Arya considered her answer carefully. "Sir, we didn't think about winning or losing. We thought about surviving, and surviving meant fighting with every weapon, every skill, and every ounce of determination we had. The enemy shot down our helicopter thinking that ended the fight. They were wrong. The fight ended when we decided it ended, which was when we were on an extraction bird heading home, not 1 second before." The general smiled. "That's exactly the attitude that makes America's military the finest in the world. And Captain, I should mention, at 28 years old, you're the youngest pilot to receive the Distinguished Flying Cross in this decade. That's not just impressive. It's a testament to the fact that leadership and courage have nothing to do with age or time in service. They're about making the right decisions under impossible pressure. You did that, and your crew is alive because of it." 6 months later, Arya was back in a Black Hawk, flying another mission over another hostile area. At 28, she'd become something of a legend in military aviation circles, not just for surviving the crash and the firefight, but for the leadership she'd shown in keeping her crew alive and turning a catastrophic shoot-down into a tactical victory. Her reputation meant she could pick her assignments, and she'd chosen to stay in combat operations rather than accept the safer training or staff positions offered to decorated pilots. Because there were other crews flying missions, other 28-year-olds leading people into danger, and she believed the best way to honor what her crew had accomplished was to keep doing the job. Every Black Hawk in the theater now carried modifications based on what Torres had pioneered: manual backup firing systems for all missile systems, allowing crews to engage threats even from crashed or damaged aircraft. The modification was officially called the Torres Protocol, though everyone in aviation circles called it the Lewis Doctrine, because she'd given the order that made it happen. Training squadrons taught the engagement as a case study, how a 28-year-old pilot and her crew of 5 turned a catastrophic shoot-down into a tactical victory through improvisation, courage, and refusal to accept defeat. Morrison had recovered from his shoulder injury and was back on flight status, now serving as a senior door gunner training others in defensive tactics. Pierce had been promoted and was now a flight engineer, using his combat experience to improve helicopter survivability. Reeves and Nash had both been selected for advanced intelligence training, their actions proving they could operate under fire as effectively as any infantry soldier. And Torres, the co-pilot who jury-rigged an impossible missile launch, was now an instructor at Fort Rucker, teaching hundreds of pilots and crew chiefs the technical skills and creative thinking that could save lives when everything went wrong. The crew had scattered to new assignments, but they stayed in contact. Every year on the anniversary of the shoot-down, they gathered at whatever base Arya was stationed at and raised a glass to impossible odds overcome through teamwork. "To the crew," Arya would say during those gatherings, holding up her glass. "To the crew," they'd respond. Torres, Pierce, Morrison, Reeves, and Nash, 6 people who'd been shot down in hostile territory and had turned an enemy victory into a legend. During one of these reunions, a young lieutenant approached Arya nervously. He was maybe 24, fresh from flight school, about to deploy on his first combat rotation. "Captain Lewis, ma'am, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm deploying next month and I'm terrified. Everyone says combat aviation is the most dangerous job in the military. How do you deal with the fear?" Arya looked at the young pilot and saw herself 4 years earlier, young, scared, but determined to do the job well. She thought about her answer carefully. Lieutenant, I'd be worried if you weren't scared. Fear means you understand the risks. But here's what I learned that day we got shot down. Fear is just information. It tells you the situation is dangerous, but it doesn't tell you what to do about it. That's where training, crew coordination, and trust come in. She gestured to her former crew members. When we crashed, I was absolutely terrified. But I had Torres to figure out the impossible technical problems. I had Pierce, who could hold off an army with that M240. I had Morrison fighting with one arm better than most people fight with two. I had Reeves and Nash, who'd never been in ground combat before but adapted instantly. Fear didn't go away. It just became less important than taking care of my crew. The young lieutenant nodded slowly. So the key is having a good crew? The key is being a good crew member yourself, Arya corrected. Focus on doing your job excellently. Trust your crew to do theirs, and remember that the enemy gets a vote, but they don't get the final say. We get the final say by refusing to accept defeat even when circumstances say we should. The lieutenant thanked her and returned to his table, looking slightly less terrified and slightly more determined. Torres, who'd overheard the conversation, smiled at Arya. You're good at the inspirational speech thing, Captain. They should make you an instructor. They tried, I declined. Instructors teach from classrooms. I'd rather teach by example. Keep flying, keep leading, keep proving that age doesn't matter as much as attitude. Speaking of age, Pierce interjected, you know they're calling you the youngest combat aviation legend in modern military history? At 28, you've got a longer legend than pilots with twice your experience. Arya shook her head. I'm not a legend. I'm just a pilot who had a really bad day and a really good crew. The legend is what we all did together, not what I did alone. But you made the calls, Morrison pointed out. You ordered Torres to try the impossible missile launch. You organized the defense. You kept us alive through leadership. Leadership is just making decisions when decisions need to be made, Arya replied. Any of you would have done the same in my position. The only difference is I was sitting in the pilot seat when things went wrong, so I got to make the calls. But implementation, actually doing the impossible stuff, that was all of you. Reeves raised her glass. How about we agree it was a team effort and we're all responsible for the fact that we're sitting here drinking instead of being statistics? I'll drink to that, Nash agreed. They all raised their glasses and drank to survival, to teamwork, and to the bond created when 6 people face death together and decide to fight their way through it. As the reunion wound down and the crew members prepared to return to their various assignments, Torres pulled Arya aside. Captain, Arya, I wanted to say something. That day, when you ordered me to try launching that Hellfire, I thought you were crazy. I was about 90% certain it would explode on the rail and kill us both. But you believed it could work, and that belief made me push through the technical problems instead of giving up. That's what leadership is, making people believe impossible things might be possible. Arya smiled. Torres, I wasn't certain it would work either. I was maybe 50% certain, which were terrible odds, but 50% chance of success was better than 0% chance of surviving that helicopter gun run. Sometimes leadership is just choosing the least bad option and committing to it completely. Well, your least bad option saved our lives and created a protocol that'll save other crews in the future. So thank you for being crazy enough to try. Thank you for being skilled enough to make it work. They shook hands, and Torres returned to his table. Arya stood alone for a moment, looking at her crew, her former crew, now scattered across the military but forever bound by what they'd survived together. She thought about the young lieutenant who'd asked about fear. She hoped he understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was feeling the fear and doing the job anyway. It was being 28 years old, shot down in hostile territory, facing impossible odds, and deciding that impossible just meant nobody had figured out how to do it yet. Because that's what she and her crew had proven. That age didn't determine capability, that impossible was just another problem to solve, and that the most dangerous thing on any battlefield wasn't the biggest weapon or the largest force. It was a group of determined people who refused to accept that being knocked down meant staying down. Their Black Hawk had been shot down by RPG in hostile territory, spinning from 800 feet to a crash that should have killed everyone aboard. But Captain Aria Lewis, at just 28 years old, kept the helicopter controlled enough for all 6 crew to survive. Then, they grabbed HK-416 rifles and an M240B machine gun, fought off 50 enemy fighters for 2 hours, and when enemy attack helicopters arrived to finish the job, Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Torres manually launched a Hellfire missile from the crashed aircraft in an improvised engagement that destroyed the enemy and rewrote the manual on combat aviation. Because surviving meant fighting with whatever they had, wherever they were, and proving that leadership, courage, and refusal to quit mattered more than age, experience, or impossible circumstances. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, you can subscribe to see more incredible stories like this one.